He walked out the way Tom Hanks has always walked out, with that particular quality of someone who has spent 40 years being exactly himself in public, and has somehow, improbably, remained exactly himself in private too. There is something about Tom Hanks that defies the usual categories of fame. He is not beloved in the calculated way that stars are beloved, not admired from a distance or elevated to untouchable heights. He is beloved the way neighbors are beloved, the way teachers are beloved, the way people are beloved when they have made the world feel safer simply by existing in it. When he came through the late show curtain, the audience rose not with the frenzy of fans meeting a celebrity but with the warmth of people greeting someone they genuinely trusted. He settled into the guest chair with the ease of a man who had sat in 1,000 guest chairs, and had long since learned that the conversation mattered more than the performance. At 68, he carried his years with the particular grace of someone who had played every man so many times he had become, in a very real sense, every man. The decent father, the accidental hero, the ordinary person who rises to meet the extraordinary moment. Stephen greeted him warmly. The audience applauded. The band played a snippet of the Forrest Gump theme because of course they did. And for the first several minutes, everything moved in that generous, easy rhythm that happens when two people who genuinely like each other are given permission to simply talk. They talked about the new film, about what it meant to still be working at 68, still finding characters that surprised him, still discovering that acting, real acting, not performing but inhabiting, required more vulnerability the longer you did it, not less. They talked about the early years, the struggling years, the years before Splashin' Big in Philadelphia and Forrest Gump, when he was just a kid from Oakland trying to figure out if he had anything real to offer. Tom was funny and self-deprecating and warm the way he always was. He told stories with perfect timing, landing jokes with the ease of someone who understood that humor was generosity, that making people laugh was making them feel less alone. He was entirely himself. And then Stephen set down his note cards. "Tom," he said quietly, "I want to ask you about something you said in an interview 20 years ago. You probably don't remember it, it was just one line, but it stayed with me." Tom turned toward Stephen with that characteristic attentiveness, the full presence of someone who had learned to really listen. "You said," Stephen continued, "that the hardest role you ever played wasn't in a movie, it was being a father, and that you'd spent 30 years terrified you were getting it wrong." Something shifted in Tom's face, not a withdrawal. Tom Hanks did not withdraw from things, but a deepening, a settling, the way light settles when you turn down the brightness and suddenly see more detail, not less. "Yeah," Tom said quietly, "I said that." "Tell me about that," Stephen said, "not the public version, the real version." Tom was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone deciding whether to answer, but the silence of someone opening a door he'd kept carefully closed for a very long time. "When I was 30 years old," Tom said, "I wrote a letter." He paused, his hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests, tightened slightly. "I had just started to have some success. Not big success yet, but enough to think maybe this was actually going to work, maybe I was actually going to be able to make a living as an actor. And my son Colin was about 5 years old, and one night I couldn't sleep because I was terrified." "Terrified of what?" Stephen asked softly. "Of failing him," Tom said simply. "Not failing at work, not failing at being famous or successful, failing at being his father. I had grown up with a father who was absent in all the ways that matter. Physically present sometimes, emotionally absent always. And I was terrified I was going to repeat that pattern, that I was going to be so consumed by work, by ambition, by the need to prove I was worth something, that I would wake up one day and realize I had missed his entire childhood." The studio was very quiet now. "So I wrote him a letter," Tom continued. "I wrote to the man he would become, the grown man, the 30-year-old version of my 5-year-old son, and I wrote the letter I would need to write if I failed, if I became the father I was terrified of becoming." His voice was steady, but something underneath it was trembling. "The letter started with 4 words," Tom said, "if I failed you." Stephen didn't move, didn't speak, just held the space. "The letter said, if I failed you, if I was absent when you needed me, if I chose work over you, if I missed the moments that mattered because I was too busy chasing moments that didn't, if I made you feel the way my father made me feel, invisible, unimportant, not quite worth the effort, then I need you to know that it wasn't because I didn't love you. It was because I didn't know how, and I'm sorry, and I hope you can forgive me. And I hope you do better with your own children than I did with you." The first tear came then, not dramatic. Tom Hanks had spent 40 years in public and had learned to carry emotion without performing it. The tear simply arrived, the way things arrive when they've been carried too long. I sealed the letter, Tom said. I put it in an envelope. I wrote on the outside, to Colin on his 30th birthday, open only if I wasn't there for you, and I put it in a safe deposit box, and I carried it for 25 years. Subscribe and leave a comment because what happens next will break you. Stephen leaned forward, his own eyes beginning to shine. Did you give it to him? Stephen asked, when he turned 30. No, Tom said, because I couldn't, because giving him that letter would have meant admitting that I had failed, and I had spent 25 years trying desperately not to fail. I had turned down roles because they would take me away from home for too long. I had restructured my career around being present. I had coached his baseball teams and attended his school plays and been there for dinner as many nights as humanly possible. I had fought against every instinct I inherited from my own father to be absent, to be unavailable, to prioritize work over presence. He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. But the terrible thing about that letter, Tom said, is that I never knew if I had actually succeeded, because the letter existed. It sat there in that safe deposit box like a time bomb, like evidence of my deepest fear. And every year that passed, I would think, should I give it to him? Should I destroy it? Should I tell him it exists? And I never did any of those things. I just carried it like a weight. Like proof that I had spent 25 years terrified of something I couldn't control. His voice broke slightly on the last word. When did Colin turn 30? Stephen asked gently. 8 years ago, Tom said. He turned 38 years ago, he's 38 now, and the letter is still in the safe deposit box and he has no idea it exists. The silence in the studio was complete, 300 people holding their breath. Why haven't you given it to him? Stephen asked, or destroyed it? Tom looked down at his hands for a long moment before answering. Because, he said slowly, I still don't know if I failed or not. I can't be the judge of that, only he can, and I'm terrified to ask him, because what if the answer is yes? What if despite everything I tried to do, despite every sacrifice and every choice and every moment I showed up, it wasn't enough? What if he carries the same wounds I carried? What if I passed on the thing I spent my entire life trying to break? Tears were falling freely now, but Tom didn't stop speaking. That letter is the most honest thing I've ever written. More honest than any script, any interview, any acceptance speech. It's the truest version of who I was at 30, terrified and broken and desperately wanting to do better than what was done to me. And I can't give it to him because I don't know if it's a confession that needs to be made or a fear that never came true, and I don't know which would be worse. Stephen stood up slowly from behind his desk. He didn't announce it, didn't perform the gesture. He simply stood because sitting felt wrong. He walked around and sat on the edge of the desk, facing Tom directly. Tom, Stephen said, and his own voice was thick now. Can I tell you what I think? Tom nodded, not trusting his voice. I think that letter is the most important thing you've ever written, Stephen said. Not because it's a confession, but because it's proof. Proof that you cared enough to be terrified. Proof that being a good father mattered more to you than anything else. Proof that you were willing to preemptively apologize for failures you hadn't even committed yet because the idea of hurting your son was unbearable to you. He paused. And I think the reason you can't give him that letter is because you already gave him something better. You gave him a father who showed up, a father who tried, a father who was so terrified of failing that he restructured his entire life to make sure he didn't. The letter was written by a 30-year-old man who was afraid, but the life you lived after that letter, that was written by a man who refused to let fear win. Tom looked up at Stephen, his face wet, his expression raw. But what if it wasn't enough? Tom whispered. What if I still failed? Then the letter matters even more, Stephen said. Because it shows him that you knew how hard it was, that you understood the stakes, that you were terrified and you tried anyway. That's not failure, Tom, that's courage. The two men looked at each other, both fathers, both sons, both carrying the weight of what gets passed down and what gets broken and what gets healed. I have a son, Stephen said quietly, and I am terrified every single day that I'm getting it wrong. And if he's anything like Colin, he probably has no idea how much of my life is organized around not failing him. And maybe that's okay. Maybe our kids don't need to see our fear, maybe they just need to see us trying. Tom nodded slowly, tears still falling but something in his expression beginning to shift. Did you bring it? Stephen asked suddenly. The letter, did you bring it with you tonight? Tom's eyes widened slightly. How did you? Because you're Tom Hanks, Stephen said with a small smile. And you're a storyteller, and storytellers don't talk about letters they wrote 38 years ago unless those letters are burning a hole in their pocket. Tom let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn envelope, yellowed with age, the handwriting on the front still clear, to Colin on his 30th birthday. "I've carried it with me for 3 months," Tom said. "Ever since I knew I was coming on the show. I don't know why, I just thought." He stopped. "I don't know what I thought." "May I ask you something?" Stephen said, "and you don't have to answer if you don't want to." Tom nodded. "What would you say to 30-year-old Tom if you could talk to him now, the man who wrote that letter? What would you tell him?" Tom looked down at the envelope in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I would tell him that he's going to be okay, that the fear he's carrying is going to make him a better father, not a worse one, that his son is going to grow up to be a good man, a kind man, a man who calls his father just to talk, a man who brings his own children to visit, a man who, when asked about his childhood, doesn't flinch." His voice broke. "I would tell him that he doesn't have to be perfect, he just has to be present, and that the letter he's writing, it's not prophecy, it's prayer, and prayers don't have to come true to matter, they just have to be honest." Tom looked up at the audience for the first time since the conversation had turned. 300 faces, many of them wet, all of them completely still. "If you're a parent," Tom said, his voice stronger now, "and you're terrified you're failing, that fear means you're trying. The parents who fail are the ones who don't care enough to be afraid. So carry the fear. Let it make you better. Let it make you present. Let it make you the person your child needs, even if you never feel like you're enough." He looked back at Stephen. "And maybe," Tom said softly, "maybe it's time to let go of the letter." "What will you do with it?" Stephen asked. Tom was quiet for a moment, then slowly he tore the envelope in half, then in half again, then again. "I don't need it anymore," he said. "I wrote it to a version of my son that doesn't exist, the version I was afraid he would become if I failed, but he didn't become that, he became himself, and that's not because I was a perfect father, it's because he's a good man, and maybe the best thing I can do is trust that, trust him, trust that whatever I did or didn't do, he turned out okay anyway." The pieces of the letter fell from his hands into his lap, 38 years of fear torn into pieces. The applause that followed started slowly, not performance applause. The kind that comes from deep recognition from people who understood what it cost to tear up that letter, to let go of that fear. Tom Hanks had carried a letter for 38 years. Tonight, in front of 300 strangers and millions of viewers, he let it go. And in doing so, he gave permission to every parent watching to let go of their own impossible standards, their own crushing fears. Their own letters written to futures that never came to pass. That night, laughter gave way to grace, and television remembered its soul.